Let me give you guys few examples of business acquisition. The first example is the asset purchase. What do we mean by asset purchase? Well, as the name implies, the asset purchase occurs when a buyer purchases a specific asset and liabilities of a target company. The target company in this instance, such as let me use equipment. I can also use inventory or customer contract and intellectual property. And this type of acquisition I'm talking about, it allows the buyer to select which type of assets and liabilities they want to assume, leaving behind those that they want. For instance, now a technology company may acquire another company in order to gain access to its proprietary software and customer base or their database in this instance. The second example is stock purchase. When we are talking of stock purchase, the buyer acquires the ownership. Of course, the buyer is the person that wants to buy, right? The buyer acquires the ownership shares or stock of the target company effectively, thereby taking control of the entire businesses. The entire control, including the assets of the business, also the liability, of course, that is included in the business, the contract rather that is being executed, and the operations that is ongoing in the business. To understand this, let me use a simple example. Let's say a large corporation may purchase all the outstanding shares of a smaller competitor company in order to expand its own market presence. From the little explanation I gave, there's big company and a small company. The small company is acting as competitor to the big company, but the big company feel like, well, we are more buoyant than you in the market and we should be more buoyant. So they will now acquire the asset of that kind of company since it's more smaller than them. Despite the smaller structure of the company, if they merge it with their own as giant as they be, they have a more expandable exposure in the market. The third example that I feel like is important to know is the merger. When we're talking of merger, a merger is a type of acquisition in which two or more, that is, it's for a merger to take place, it has to be within two or more companies to combine in order to form a new kind of entity. And it often have a strategic move to create synergies in different forms, thereby increasing the market share or enhance competitiveness. A good example of merger is between, let's say, telecommunications giants AT&T and the Time Warner to create a Warner Media. The fourth example that is important to know is a horizontal acquisition. When we are talking about horizontal acquisition, I do not necessarily mean something horizontal. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean by horizontal acquisition is that it occurs when a company acquires a competitor in the same industry. Let's say they are in the music industry. A horizontal acquisition, if there is a acquisition within a music industry, of course, that's what we know as a horizontal acquisition. For another instance now, if one chain company acquires another competing fast food chain, in this type of situation, it is considered as an horizontal acquisition. Another example is also vertical acquisition. In a vertical acquisition takeover, a company requires a business that operates in a different stage of supply chain. For instance, a car manufacturer might acquire a tire manufacturing company to secure a steady supply of tires, more than the way they are before. The sixth example is the conglomerate acquisition. What do we mean by conglomerate acquisition? A conglomerate acquisition involves the purchase of a business in an entirely different industry, unlike the horizontal acquisition. This one now, it involves the purchase of a business in an industry that is not within their vicinity. And this type of acquisition, it allows a company to diversify its operation and to reduce the risk. For example now, a technology company may acquire a food and beverage company. From that example, the technology company has its own industry. Food and beverage industry, they are also another distinct industry. So in this type of situation, they can acquire the asset of it. That's what we mean by conglomerate acquisition. Another example is the friendly acquisition. So in a friendly acquisition, both the buyer and the target company's management, they both agree to the sale and the transaction is conducted with cooperation and mutual consent of the two parties. Another example, which is the eighth example, is the hostile takeover. What we mean by hostile takeover is that in contrast to a friendly acquisition, now a hostile takeover occurs when the buyer attempts to acquire a company against the wishes of the management of the company or the board of directors of the company they wanted to acquire the asset. And this involves the purchasing a significant number of the target company's shares in the open market. I hope that little one is taken. Another example is the leverage buyout. The acronym for this is the LBO. In a LBO, a buyer often with the assistance of borrowed funds. Borrowed fund is in this instance. He acquires a company with the intention of restructuring it to increase its value. The private equity firms commonly use this kind of strategy. Another example is the tender offer. What we mean by tender offer is that a tender offer is a public solicitation by the buyer to purchase a specified numbers of shares of a publicly traded target company at a set price, typically at a premium to the market price. Although the shareholders of the target company can choose to accept or reject such kind of offer. The 11th example is the reverse takeover. Acronym for the reverse takeover is the RTO. When we are talking about the RTO, a privately held company acquires a publicly traded company, effectively thereby allowing the private company to go public without an initial public offering, that is the IPO. All those examples I just gave earlier are just a few examples of the many ways in which business acquisition can occur. Although I've already highlighted the most crucial one that used to occur in real world situation. And the specific type of acquisition chosen often depends on the strategic goal and circumstances of the parties that were being involved.